Hello, everybody. This is Tambry. Coletta, welcome to our webinar today from Quick Start on Data ONTAP storage systems with Windows environment. I'll give you just a couple more minutes for everyone to join and we'll be all set. Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Ready to go here. So Quick Start was formerly Unitech, and we're an innovative technical training company. We are an authorized learning partner for numerous technologies, Cisco, Microsoft, VMware, and NetApp. And we've been a NetApp authorized learning partner for 17 years. We provide training with public classes all over the United States. We do custom on-premise classes, and we also offer web-based classes. And I'm a strategic enterprise account manager, and I assist my NetApp reps and partners within the Western region to coordinate their clients with their NetApp training. I put my contact information in the chat box, my email address and my phone number, and I'd be happy to help you with any NetApp training for your clients. I'm going to introduce Alicia Townsend, and she is a very tenured instructor with us and very versed in Microsoft and NetApp, and she's going to showcase what we can offer with our trainings. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, just please put them into the chat box, and we'll see if we can answer them during the webinar, or else we might wait till the end. So we'll just see how it goes and go with the flow. And right now, I'd like to introduce Alicia Townsend.
Hello! I want to say good morning, but it's afternoon for most everybody else, so I won't say that. All right, let me share my desktop here. So yes, my name is Alicia Townsend. Just give you a little idea of my background. I've been torturing computers since I was in, goodness gracious, 5th grade or so. Been working with NetApp storage since it was on tap, 7.3, even a little bit before then. And I do both training and consulting, and I am excited to be here. So what we're going to look at today here is really just on-tap storage with Windows. So, a lot of different ways to go through this. I thought about trying to demonstrate how to configure things, but that would take a little bit more time than we had here. So what I thought I'd practice, or I'd focus on here, are sort of best practices, and then just some configuration tips and tricks along the way, and how obviously NetApp and the Windows environment sort of fit together here. So we're going to start off talking about two main protocols, obviously. So we've got SMB, which we used to call CIFS, but now we call it SMB. And we've got SAN over there. So we'll talk about, again, some best practices, just some good things to keep in mind when you're configuring it for your environment. Then we'll take a look at HyperV, right? So obviously, Microsoft's virtualization solution, given VMware, real good run for its money there. Again, some general good practices for configuring it. And SQL Server, my favorite best friend. I love data. So I love Microsoft SQL Server, and storing my data files over on NetApp storage, being able to back up those huge databases nearly instantaneously with the snapshot copies and replicate these guys for DR purposes and such. Really, really useful. So again, talk about a few points there. I cannot talk about NetApp and the Windows environment without trying to push PowerShell on you. So again, there is a NetApp PowerShell Toolkit. You are a Windows administrator. I cannot stress, you guys got to learn PowerShell, okay? If you don't already know it, hop on the bandwagon. Microsoft is forcing you into it. You know, depending upon what products you already support, you know, a lot of them like Exchange, which actually I didn't include this week, but Exchange, you know, long ago, they were taking stuff out of the GUI and you can only do certain tasks in PowerShell. If you're going into Azure, it's a great way to manage your environment. So integrating your regular management PowerShell scripts with managing your storage using PowerShell just makes it that much more powerful. And again, really, really handy. You can go have a cup of coffee while the script is running. Tell your boss, you know, this is taking a really long time. Anyway. And then the last little bit there, just sort of giving you an idea of really some of the best backup solution. And I just really actually wanted to introduce SnapCenter there if you did not know about SnapCenter. So that's what we're going to finish off with. So first little piece then is we're looking at SMB. So one of the things that I just want to point out that I did on these slides for reference purposes, so a lot of this material is actually just kind of pulled from NetApp's TR. So good reference material here. You know, I obviously pulled some of the highlights. These are longer documents. I do encourage you to go and download them. They're handy documents to have locally so that, you know, they can be indexed by your desktop or whatever, and you can search through them. Really good guidelines. So first off, we're going to start here with SMB. So my first point is we now call it SMB and we don't call it SIFs. And, you know, it's been SMB all along. SMB predates SIFs. It's just Microsoft with NT4, you know, they called the file sharing SIFs, and that's just become sort of our nickname for SMB. But really, once we started doing like SMB 2.0 and 3.0, even Microsoft saying, okay, we're just going to call it SMB, which is what it really is. So call it SMB, not SIFs. When I do training, I always call it both. Like I'm always trying to like say SMB or SIFs because I want to make sure people understand what I'm talking about. But it really should be called SMB nowadays. So second little piece here that I mentioned, SMB1. Okay, so Microsoft's phasing out SMB1 and NetApp's following suit. So in On Tap 9.3, SMB1 is actually disabled by default. Before 9.3, it was actually enabled by default. So you can come along and enable it if necessary. And if you are using an earlier version of On Tap, and you know, maybe you're going to 9.3 or you just want to see like, you know, really how many of my users are really using SMB1, there's a nice statistics show command that you can use, and you can really specifically filter out, you know, how many operations are using that particular version of SMB, and then make your decision. Like, do we really need to disable it or do we need to keep it around because we actually do have some older systems that are still using it, okay? So try to go for 2 or 3. 3, obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about 3, especially when we get into HyperV and SQL over here. But again, Microsoft's phasing it out, so you might want to think about upgrading a few of those operating systems, guys. Anyway. All right, next piece here, infinite volumes. So, you know, I don't know where you guys are in, you know, various features that you've been implementing in cluster data on top. Some of you still might be using 7 mode, but FYI, cluster data on tap introduced what were called infinite volumes. Really used for NAS data and for the use case of I've got, you know, a ton of files, a ton of data, and I need a single mount point for my client. Like maybe some application has a bunch of log files or, you know, audio files that it needs to save to one place. And I don't have enough storage on any given node within my cluster. So NetApp's first answer to this were these infinite volumes. Okay, they created a single mount point, but they really only supported SMB1. Okay, so they had some limitations, obviously, we're talking Windows. They work nicely for NFS, by the way, but they really only supported SMB1. So one of the things that we've got nowadays in On Tap 9.3 are what we call flex group volumes. So these are really a replacement for the infinite volume. So, you know, FYI, if you have been using infinite volumes at this point in your clusters, and again, you're thinking about upgrading, might want to think about migrating those guys over to, again, what we call flex group volumes. Flex group volumes don't have a lot of the same limitations as infinite volumes do. Number one, they support SMB 2 and 3 as far as the protocols are concerned, and in fact can be treated a lot like flex vols themselves, but they're just really multiple flex vols that again are seen as one map point. So like I can snapshot them all at once and I can snap mirror them. So management wise, they're great. The system helps kind of like load balance access across them. One of the problems with the infinite volumes is they had a single namespace constituent, which ended up being sort of a bottleneck because you always had to go there to like figure out where the files exist. And so we don't have those same type of issues with the flex group volume. So there are multiple reasons to move to flex group volumes, but you know, top of the list would be, again, simply the support for SMB. And now I do have support beyond SMB 1.0. So let's see what else we got here. So SMB 2.0, we've got the durable file handles. So one of the problems that we've had with SIFs in the past is when I had to do failovers, like storage or cluster node failovers, controller failover, even in 7.0, is that anybody who had sessions, then those sessions would get disconnected as part of that process. But with SMB 2.0 and up, obviously into 3 and such, we have these durable file handles. And so it actually means that they can basically, reconnect easily, very similar to the file handles that are used over in NFS, which is what NFS, allows NFS to handle that failover process. So when I'm moving my lifts around, again, as part of maybe even a failover process, right? I've got to migrate lifts, or my lifts have to fail over someplace else. My clients will not be disconnected. Their connection will be immediately reestablished. And I put in here nice little command line, the vServer lock show, that can show you how many of those locks are actually using a durable file handle, and it'll show up as like type durable. So it's a good way of kind of checking to see what you're using there. Next we've got SMB signing. So what was it? Oh, now I've forgotten the term for it. Well, in general, anything that has more security takes more overhead. That's my general rule of thumb in life. It's much more of a hassle. But SMB signing, obviously, there's a little overhead that is incurred by it, so I'm going to get some performance hit here. So as in a lot of security features, unless you absolutely need them, maybe you don't have to enable it. So just make sure it's enabled only when necessary. Again, general best practice. And then the last one here that I've got here is regard to our MTU sizes. So, we can change our MTU size, and we can change to a larger MTU size. And again, we could benefit of having a larger MTU size when we have very large files, and we're talking, in this case, greater than gig, large files that we are copying or moving quite a bit. And we can enable this option, is large MTU enabled true, through our vServer SIFs options there. But you have to keep in mind that enabling a larger MTU size might not actually be highly beneficial. It's beneficial if most of the files, or like all of the files that I'm dealing with, are large files, and they're going to benefit from this. But if I have a mixed environment, and that's what I mean by mixed mode there, if I have a mixed environment, then it actually might cause latency when we're talking about the smaller files. So if that is the case, then actually NetApp recommends maybe putting them on separate aggregates, okay? That's something to think about, right? Usually, our rule of thumb is on a single node, create an aggregate as big as it can possibly be. That's sort of that keep it simple type of process, right? Philosophy there. But there are use cases, right, to create other aggregates. One of them might be I have different types of disks, right? I've got my lower SATA disks and I've got some SSDs, and I've got different data that I want to store on those different types of disks because they have different IOP needs. So there's, or I wanted to create a, a flash pool, right? Like a hybrid aggregate that uses some SSDs for caching purposes. So there are use cases to create more than one aggregate on a single node. And again, in this case, if my file copying, moving process is high priority to me for these large files, but obviously, I'm storing other data on these particular nodes as well, this is yet, again, another use case where we might benefit from having more than one aggregate. Okay. Now, next little topic here we're looking at is my friend SAN. SAN is highly complicated, usually to set up. So I usually recommend that people follow whatever step-by-step guidelines that you're given. Make sure you check off each step on moving parts to correctly configuring SAN. So that's my general best practice recommendation here. But the good news is, since On Tap 9.1, we now support 12 nodes for SAN. Woo! Right? The maximum number of nodes in our cluster is still at 24. That's if we're supporting NAS. But the number of nodes that we can support if we're using SAN, that's increased over time, right? Since CDOT first came out in 8.0 or whatever, we've gone from 6 to 8, 10, 12 now. So, it's obviously somewhat of a moving target. But one of the things that I want to point out is, yes, at this point, the maximum number of nodes has increased, but the maximum number of LUNs for the entire cluster has actually remained the same. Thus, max number of LUNs is the same. What does that mean? That means that, if I divide this, and I'm not going to do the math in my head, but basically, when I maybe had 8 nodes before, I had a certain I had the same maximum number of nodes. So divide 98,000 some odd by 8, and that was the maximum number of LUNs per node. Well, now I'm simply dividing the 98,000 some odd by 12, and that's the maximum number of LUNs per node. So again, slightly different there. So just keep that in mind in your planning. And some of you might never reach those maxes, but I like to make sure we all know what the maximums are. Let's see what else we have. When we talk about volumes, we learned about flex vols when you took the On Tap admin course years ago. You were taught about mounting volumes to the namespace. Well, namespaces are really only used for NAS purposes, right? Those mount, I do vol mount command, or when I am creating the volume, I specify its junction path attribute, right? That's what we're talking about. And those become the paths that if I'm to share out that volume or export out the volume, those are the paths that basically my clients are going to. But for SAN, my clients, those initiators, the hosts out there, right? The host initiators, they're simply mapping to a LUN. So they don't really care about the volume a whole bunch. So volumes themselves actually don't need to be mounted to the namespace if they contain LUNs. Along those same lines, I always just like to make sure we're clear. Volumes probably should only contain LUNs or NAS content, not both. No real good use case for a flex vol or a flex group volume nowadays, by the way, to contain both a LUN as well as NAS content. My aggregate, certainly, right? That's where we're getting, whatever protocol you want, we're going to support kind of thing. But at the volume level, it just doesn't make sense because that's different type of data. It's going to have different backup needs, different replication needs. So, my snapshots become kind of useless if I put them all on the same volume. Not a really good plan. So typically I have, and usually actually, by the way, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, right? 1 LUN, 2 volume. We'll put 1 in there. 1 LUN to volume type ratio. There are use cases where maybe I'm extending, like a data store with ESXi, I might have more than 1 LUN in a volume, but usually it's 1 LUN per volume. Again, allowing me to create those nice consistent backups because the backups are done at the volume level, right? That's where the snapshots are created. All right. As far as my data lifts are concerned, right, the data lift configuration is much more complicated when we are talking SAN than we are talking NAS. Number one, in case you did not know, SAN lifts do not migrate, at least while they are up. So we'll put live migrate up there. Do not live migrate, nor do they fail over, i.e. if the port goes down, they do not automatically get reassigned like the NAS lifts do, or even like the management lifts do, okay? So SAN lifts are assigned to a particular Ethernet port or a particular fiber channel port. So in order to make sure that I can like load balance, in order to make sure that I can get direct access to those LUNs, best practice is at minimum 1 SAN data lift per node. And if I have more than 1 fiber channel or Ethernet network for like iSCSI, then 1 SAN data lift per node per network. Now that's great then. So that means if I've got 12 nodes and say a single network, then I'm going to have at least 12 data lifts for whatever V server is going to serve up these LUNs. And depending upon your operating system, that might be fine. But certain hosts, so you do have to keep in mind in this architecture, certain hosts do have a limitation as to basically the number of connections they can have. So in that case, you might have to, you might not be able to take advantage of like all 12 nodes and have all those ports there. So you've got to do, it's a little balancing there. But start off with the 1 data lift per node kind of rule there, per network. And again, do your research as far as those host initiator operating systems and what they can support. And then the last little point on this particular slide talks about NPIV, Import ID virtualization. So I think one of my next slides, I also mentioned this. In fiber channel, right, we're taking our fiber channel switches, the fabric, and we are simply, kind of mapping through which WWPNs can see each other, right? That's how we can sort of configure those fiber channel switches. So the WWPNs in this case are assigned virtually to those fiber channel lifts. Thus, NPIV, the port ID virtualization, has to be enabled for this configuration to work. So that means that your fabric has to be enabled for NPIV in order to work with NetApp storage, again, if we were doing cluster data on tap, of course. Okay. And then just to kind of continue, as I said, all of these WWPNs are virtual. However, the nodes themselves actually have WWPNs. And in fact, they are consistently ID'd as 50, 0A, 09, 8, whatever. So we don't want to zone for those guys, right? That's that sort of matching of the WWPNs, which WWPNs things that can see each other. We don't want to zone for those guys. What we want to zone for are the WWPNs that are assigned to the lifts themselves, okay? Those data lifts that we're creating for our SVMs. So if you want to double check, you can always see the physical ones by doing an FCP adapter show type command there. So I'm showing you, and if you want to see the ones that belong to my data lifts, that's net int show, or if you really wanted to spell it all out, network interface show. But net int show, of course, works just as well, because I don't usually always have to spell out the entire world, which, because we're all lazy, makes life nice. All right. Now, one of the last little pieces here I'm mentioning is having a management interface. So at least 1 lift per SVM that is enabled for management access. Now, this is different than node management. This is different than the cluster management lifts. It's not the same. This is a LIF that belongs to an SVM and allows me to connect directly to the SVM and send, commands to it. And it's used actually by lots of some of the backup software that we're going to talk about in just a sec, or management software. So like SnapDrive, which is a product that we've had forever in the SAN world for NetApp. SnapDrive needs administrative access to the SVMs in order to communicate with the storage systems and create the LUNs or expand the size of the LUNs or whatever it is that we're trying to do with the LUNs. So SnapDrive is a product that is installed over on the initiators, and then it is again, a piece that is configured basically to connect nowadays to your SVM. And it's necessary, by the way, for a few products like the Snap Manager products, which I'll mention a couple of them as we move forward. So anyway, so I do need a management LIF. So a LIF, no data protocol, oops, did not mean to go forward there. No data protocols assigned to it. And then I need to modify its firewall policy and specify management. Now I'm giving you the options here that are used in the command line, but you could do it through the GUI as well. And in fact, if you create the SVM through System Manager, i.e. the GUI, there is an option, create management LIF. So it will do it for you, right? So a lot of those guys are nice and useful. And along those lines, there are a few other tools that are very, very helpful to install on the initiators. Now, to a certain extent, it depends upon what the operating system of the initiator is. But since we were talking Windows, yay, we don't have to kind of go into all those details. But one thing that I do want to make sure that you understand is there is a tool called the Host Utility Kit. And it is usually mentioned when we talk SAN storage. Yes, it is required in the sense that the optimization changes that it makes are incredibly important, and if you need to call NetApp support, they're going to check to see whether you have the Host Utility Kit installed or not. Okay? But I don't necessarily have to install the Host Utility Kit. There is another tool called NetApp DSM, which depending upon your agreement with NetApp, you might have to pay a few pennies for. But it does the exact same optimization changes as the Host Utility Kit. Okay? Plus, it can handle your multipathing. And yes, the Windows operating system does have multipathing option for it nowadays built in. Okay, and we're using MPIO nowadays instead of MCS. But actually, the NetApp DSM is actually just a little bit more efficient, and therefore is actually a really good investment to optimize, again, my connectivity, whether I'm using iSCSI or fiber channels, really making like some registry changes, queue depth type option changes, and again, gives me a little bit more control over the multipathing. And no matter what you use for the multipathing, you do want to make sure that you have both MPIO multipathing, as well as the fact that it is ALUA. I always want to do the hula when I say ALUA, but it is ALUA enabled. ALUA is the algorithm that allows it to figure out what is the most optimized path to the LUN that I'm trying to get to. So this is my host here, and I got a little switch here, and I've got some nodes. Yes, my handwriting is horrible. My parents were doctors. I blame them. And I've got, a LUN over here. And so I've got at least one data LIF per node connected to this lovely switch. Okay, so one data LIF per node connected to this switch for my SVM. ALUA is going to allow the host to see, hey, I really want to go through this data LIF because this is the node that currently owns this volume. And it's smart enough so that if I move the volume that contains the node to another node, it will redirect over to there. So it's always trying to make sure I get that optimized path. And in fact, I'm just really avoiding that cluster interconnect. So, usually SAN, we want to make sure that we have the least, latency possible. We want to try to optimize as much as possible here. Okay. And then, again, I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm going to run out of time if I keep chitty-chatting too much. But other piece here is when you are configuring, MPIO is all about multiple sessions. Now, they're not single connection, multiple, or single session, multiple connections, but multiple sessions. So what you end up doing is you'll have multiple targets. These are all those data lifts. And this is done from the Windows operating system, by the way. Windows, iSCSI, initiator software.
Alicia, can I ask a question now before you move on further?
Sure.
Okay. All right, we have a question. I have a DBA role.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Unfortunately, I don't have any books off the top of my head, but maybe that's something, if you can give us your email or something like that, I can get some to you.
Okay.
How's that? Yeah, and in general, actually, I don't have books, but I can like point you to some articles and stuff like that online. This stuff changes so quickly that books are not very helpful. They can come too out of date really quickly. But yeah, let's, if you can get the contact information, maybe I can pull some stuff together for you. Okay? All right. So here again, I just want to explain the sessions for each, basically IP address that I have on the initiator, on the host that wants to connect to those lines. I'm going to map them up to a different data lift over within my cluster. And that's going to establish those sessions for me. And of course, even before this, you say, enable multipathing. And we got to this, clicking on advanced. All right, so we're going to move on to HyperV here. Again, nice little TR reference up there, but fixed VHDs, best practice over here, especially if they're IO intensive. I find with HyperV, fixed VHDs in general tend to be a little bit better. So just a good recommend. Hey, Tammy, can you mute yourself a little bit? Or kind of, or thank you. And then dedicated virtual switch. So over on HyperV, a lot of these points have to deal with the scenario where, I've got my hypervisor over here. This is my HyperV. And so it might have some storage that it's using over on NetApp to store the VHDs. But sometimes these VMs over there, we want to use iSCSI on the VMs, and we want to directly allow them to mount their own LUN. Okay, because maybe they're a SQL server, and we want to use SnapManager for SQL, so we want it to be able to directly see that LUN and manage the snapshots and such of that LUN. So in those cases, that's what we're talking about. So dedicated virtual switch for guest storage connection within the VM. So different virtual switch that's being used for this type of connection versus this type of connection. Okay. Make sure that the host and guest iSCSI data paths use different physical ports, and again, separate virtual switches. So you really want to separate out that traffic as much as you possibly can when you have HyperV using storage for VHDs over in my NetApp cluster, and I've got guest VMs that directly want to mount LUNs and such over on the storage system. So totally separate them out. And then the last little bit on this slide says avoid the NIC teaming. So, NIC teaming is basically where I'm trying to maybe load balance or get a little more throughput from a couple of physical NICs on my initiator. The problem is they don't adjust well when we do lift failover. So NetApp really does recommend, just avoid the NIC teaming as far as configuring that over on the Windows server. I can do still can do optimization and sort of a NIC teaming-like configuration on the storage end by creating virtual interfaces. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, from the initiator's point of view, we're not going to team the NICs together. We're just going to, assign to the individual ports, basically. Okay. Another thing we always want to mention then in HyperV nowadays, We support SMB. I don't know how many of you are using this out there. I still haven't seen anybody really use this in production. We've been playing with it a lot, but you know, it's really Microsoft's answer to the fact that VMware forever and a day has supported both SAN storage and NFS data stores. So with SMB3, we can now support accessing or storing our VHDs on actual file shares. Now, we do need to make sure that continuous availability is enabled for this. And we need to make sure that it is properly configured. So we need like a witness configuration for this. Again, I need at least the one data lift per node for every SVM. I want to set the automatic node referral set to false. So there's a whole laundry list of configuration settings that we need to make both on the Windows side as well as over on the NetApp side to make sure that this works. Okay, so again, not going through the entire configuration, but the big warning is it doesn't mean I just go create a share and I map to it on my HyperV server and we're good to go. It's not really where we're going with this, okay? It's not like a regular share, okay? So just keep that in mind, but we do support it. So it's something to maybe think about in your environments, maybe test it out, see if you're getting any better performance. You know, if you're using fiber channel for your SAN, that usually wins out performance-wise. But if you're choosing between iSCSI and SMB, then they're actually kind of close. And usually the NAS protocol, one of the reasons it's a little more attractive is it's a little bit easier to manage. Like if I need to make the volume bigger, I can just make the volume bigger. Woo! But if I need to make the volume bigger and it's a LUN, right? And I'm using SAN protocols, that's a little bit more of a hassle, right? I got to go increase the size of the LUN over on the storage system. I got to make sure the operating system extends that volume. So again, there's some management reasons. Snapshots work much more easily if I'm using SMB because again, it's NetApp really, it's NetApp's OS and Waffle automatically will flush everything there. So I don't necessarily need all these Snap Manager, Snap Creator type products to create consistent snapshots. So, well, I do, it's still in a certain sense, but again, it's just a little bit easier to manage. So it's something to maybe consider. And then down here, this is actually just when, you know, if you're migrating then, so if you do choose to go the SMB route, when you're migrating, make sure that you've got the copy offload functionality enabled. What that does is, you know, again, this is my HyperV server. Say these are my two nodes. I'm trying to move this volume from here to here. It'll actually copy the data blocks across the cluster interconnect versus trying to like copy them up and through the HyperV server. So, you know, it's offloading that copy process just to the storage end of the game. Now, my buddy SQL here, some similar considerations, right? So we have things like, yes, we have SMB support over here. And a lot of the same rules that we were just talking about for HyperV tend to apply over here, including enabling whatever the volumes that we're using for Unicode, by the way. Now, a couple other things to keep in mind here. So with SQL Server, of course, I can have multiple data files, and they can be in what we call a file group. So NetApp's recommendation is if we are chopping up, right, when we create a SQL database, we get an MDF file, and we get an LDF file. But take that MDF file, and I want to have separate files. Maybe I've got some older data. I don't want to back it up as often. Maybe I want to create a partition table, whatever it is. So those kinds of things. But if I have multiple files in the single file group, recommendation, same size, same auto grow parameters, just work better as far as NetApp is concerned, increasing the sizes, and make sure that it's growing in terms of megabytes versus its percentages. That's actually not a bad practice across the board with SQL. So NetApp recommends it, but it's, again, not necessarily NetApp specific. The mount points, use NTF mount points, so like you're mounting it to a volume with a name. and it should, or like a folder or directory with a name, and that name actually, convention is, should match the name of whatever the volume is that I am mounting to over on the NetApp side of the game. And again, reason for this is it allows me obviously to create lots of mount points. And if I've got lots of data file or databases and their log files and I want to separate all those pieces out, you know, it allows me to get beyond the 26 letters that the drive letters give me. Now, down here we have the disable local snapshot copy schedules. This is actually kind of, I put it over here because it was in the 4590, but I would consider that a best practice for all of SAN. That when I am using LUNs, if I simply create snapshots of the volumes that contain the LUNs, the operating system that's writing to that LUN is clueless as to the fact that I'm creating the snapshot. So it never quiesced all its writes down to that LUN. So it's really an inconsistent, quote unquote, backup of that content. So in the SAN world, what you really have to think about is, okay, when we're going to create this backup, everybody needs to know what's going on. So the host initiator's operating system needs to know that we're about to back up all its stuff so it can quiesce the writes. And the applications typically, they also need to know that we're about to back up stuff because they need to make sure they're quiescing things and putting their database or whatever the application is in a state to know that it's about to be backed up. Because again, there's a certain process, especially for like database applications, that they need to go through so that when I go through a restore, my expectation is I should be able to restore to a point in time. Okay? I don't just back up data files and just restore the data file. I need to replay, log files and things like that usually in order to get my database back to a consistent point when I'm going through the restore process. So the database needs to know it was being backed up in order for that restore to go cleanly later on, or else the backup is kind of useless. So backup and restore always go together. So if we are creating snapshots based upon a local snapshot schedule that's firing off on the NetApp systems, again, it will be inconsistent. So recommendation, disable those, and I'll talk in 2 seconds about a couple of products that can help ease all that communication. Zero out the snapshot reserve. It's also a general recommendation in the SAN world. Just easier just to monitor the amount of space that's actually being used in the volume, snapshots and data altogether. Deduplication doesn't generally benefit us a whole bunch in the SQL world because most SQL databases are designed not to have duplicate data. If they're an analysis type of database, like something I'm reporting off of, like a data warehouse, then they actually might benefit. But most databases are not data warehouses. They are normalized to the third norm. No duplicate data should be in them. Therefore, dedupe doesn't help with them. And then the last bit is my favorite point for SQL always is TempDB. Optimization again for TempDB, multiple data files for the TempDB, usually 1 per proc, maxing out at 8, and they should be on separate volumes. So separate LUNs and volumes for that TempDB because it's volatile, like a paging file, right, for the operating system. So as I mentioned, I was going to tell you about a couple of the products that NetApp has to ease that communication from application to operating system to NetApp so that we all are on the same page. We're about to back things up. And so the traditional tool is actually SnapManager for SQL, and it's usually partnered with SnapDrive, which I mentioned earlier. Okay. But there's a new player in the game, and that is SnapCenter. And one of the benefits of SnapCenter is it is centrally managing everything. Versus SnapManager for SQL, I would have for like my SQL servers, and then there's SnapManager for Exchange for my Exchange servers, SnapManager for HyperV. That's a lot of stuff to have. But SnapCenter gives me a way of centrally managing it. But it still doesn't have some of the same options that I do with SnapCenter, or SnapManager for SQL. And that's really kind of a maturity level. So the product to watch is SnapCenter. That's where a lot of development effort is going from NetApp. They're really going to be putting a lot of time into it. And so some of those same features that we were getting from our Snap Manager product should start showing up more and more in SnapCenter as that product matures. So just kind of keep that in mind for the future there. And then I can't talk about anything without talking about the cloud. So something to keep in mind, you know, NetApp does have AltaVault, so I can use AltaVault to like back up my SQL servers to the cloud. AltaVault is basically virtual host that can run in the cloud, both in Azure and AWS. And I could snap mirror my content to the cloud as well and look upon the cloud as sort of my DR site. So again, few options there. Integrating with the cloud. The cloud is the future. I was just doing Azure yesterday. All right. Next little piece here is that toolkit, as I said. So it's called the Data ONTAP NetApp Toolkit. It is now up to version 4.6. Put the URL in there. You can go find it on the NetApp support site. For 2,000 commandlets, it's upgraded to support 9.4 as far as ONTAP is concerned. I can connect to my cluster. So use the NC commands when we're talking cluster. The ones that start commandlets, the ones that have NA in the noun portion of the commandlet, those are for 7 mode. It still has the 7 mode commandlets in it. You install it. Then you can import the module, and then you can use, again, commandlets. So I can create a script. My script creates an SVM. That SVM, I go and create some volumes. I create some LUNs on those volumes. I create my initiator groups. I map the initiator groups to my Windows system. I'm connecting to my Windows system. I'm enabling iSCSI. I'm configuring iSCSI. I can do all of that through PowerShell. So again, if this is something that I am doing again and again, I use computers because I am lazy. If I find myself doing the same thing again and again, I want to script it. Thus, PowerShell is the answer. So PowerShell is huge over the Windows side. If you have not done it already, by the way, Quick Start does have a PowerShell course, 10961. I do recommend it for all Windows administrators. 5-day course. It is a lovely course. I love teaching. So I've now sold that piece. And then for those out there who might be using E-Series systems, there's actually a PowerShell toolkit as well for Centricity. So just FYI, you guys don't get a lot of play in the world, but I thought I would mention that. And then this last little slide here, before I finish up, running a little bit over time of what I wanted to, just talking about, I was going to talk about more backup options, but I wanted to focus here on SnapCenter. And so I just want to explain the architecture of SnapCenter is, instead of full applications like what we were doing with Snap Manager, I just have these little plugins. So on, you know, whatever the system is, I install the plugin for SQL or plugin for VMware vSphere here in this particular slide, or plugin for HyperV. So I install the plugin on those systems, and then Snap Manager communicates with those systems. It'll communicate with the application, it will communicate with the operating system, and then of course it is also communicating with my cluster. So it is doing what I need it to do. It is handling that end-to-end communication. Application knows we're about to back you up. Do what you need to do, dude. He does it. He says, okay, I'm ready. Then the operating system's going to flush all those writes down to those LUNs. And he says, okay, I'm all good. And then NetApp can go and create those snapshots. So again, the benefit of SnapCenter is from a single pane, basically a single tool, I can manage all my backups of my various different applications versus, again, the Snap Manager products that we've been more traditionally using. I have to go into each one of those interfaces and change it. Over time, there was another product like Snap Protect. It seems to have lost the game here. So as I said, SnapCenter here is really the player to watch going forward. Phew! All right, so I am done. Ha! I finished 5 minutes over what I was planning. So at this point, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, Tammy, take it away.
Okay, well, basically, yeah, I just want to see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask before we sign off. You can put it into the chat box. and Alicia can clarify anything for you if you need it. Or any comments at all that you'd like to say. Well, I left my email and phone number within the chat box, and I can certainly help you. You can also come to our website, quickstart.com, and view all the technologies that we offer training for. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or support you and your team for any training. And we really appreciate you coming, and we hold these webinars a couple times a month on various technologies, and so please keep looking on LinkedIn, and also you can reach out to me and I can always send you a link, and I'm sure I'll be in touch with you shortly. And thank you so much for coming to our webinar. And thank you, Alicia.
No problem, my pleasure. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you.